All right, so let's talk about UX prototyping rookie mistakes. This is going to be a little duplicative of my previous video that was called Expectations for a UX Prototype. But this one goes into like the mistakes I see that students or just like other designers make when I see those prototypes, in their design portfolios. So I wanted to create this video to kind of help you look ahead as well. So let me change the screen here. Okay, so the first mistake I see is typically showing only one linear flow of screens. So when you create your flow chart, chances are, to show complexity of your app design, chances are there's multiple features that you're designing for. Um, but like only giving one or two screens for each feature isn't enough to demonstrate like scope or complexity of the product. Um, so whenever possible, make sure to explore the different features of your app. And if you need to scope down the product design, then make sure you set those expectations at the outset. Otherwise, folks who are looking at your portfolio may feel like they're looking at an incomplete project. Sometimes this also happens because there's just not enough complexity in the app. So that would be a great time to consult with another designer or a teacher to better understand how you can kind of like push the boundaries of your app design or functionality. Additionally, rushing a project is also like a huge issue that's very evident when you only see one linear flow of screens. So give yourself the time you need to do a really good job. When it's a project that ends up on your portfolio, you want to make sure it attracts the right attention. And when someone has the impression that the project was rushed, that does not give a good impression, right? That doesn't make the case for you to get hired. So, when possible, put the right amount of time in and make sure it shows the complexity and scope that you've originally proposed for your app design. The next mistake is dead ends in the app. So sometimes like you're going through a flow and then suddenly like you can't do anything anymore. And that's typically because there hasn't been something designed or built to send someone back to the home screen or like to the central like area functionality. Sometimes like they just forgot to put the button menu or they forgot to design in navigation. Sometimes things that look like links aren't links, therefore it becomes a dead end in the design. And similarly, it can also be related to like hyper focusing on one specific journey in the greater app design. So wherever possible, remove the impression that there are dead ends in your app. Um, your buttons should always go somewhere else. Um, someone should always be able to go back to the home screen. If it looks like a button or a link, they should be tappable. Like those are really like basic things. Um, Basic like rookie mistakes I see in some of these app designs. Uh, Related to that point, when you have no way to get home, it means that the user kind of gets stuck on whatever that last page is. So now they have to figure out a way to refresh your prototype. If you're using Figma, if you're using Adobe XD, there's shortcuts that designers know on how to reset the experience, but the typical hiring manager or someone that you've enlisted for help for user testing isn't going to know how to do that. So they're just automatically going to get stuck, and they may not be able to accurately gauge or evaluate the work that you did. So when you're testing your app design on a device, see if those dead ends exist. Do you give people a consistent way to get back to the home screen? Is there a way to reset the experience? So essentially like kind of like this button that allows you just to like start over again. Um, in some cases, like especially in group projects where the work is divided amongst multiple designers, sometimes the navigation becomes inconsistent. So like one designer will have a menu over here, the next one will have it on like the other side of the screen, the next person will put it in like a sticky like app or nav bar at the bottom of the screen. These like these foundational elements, these signposts, should be like discussed early on, or at least like the optimal places for this type of content should be revealed over time as you're working as a group together. Or if you're working on this individually, these are part of like the foundation of the app design, just like having consistent places for navigation and having consistent placement across your app experience. So just because, like for Android phones, just because there's like a hard back button, don't assume that those exist on iPhones because they don't. Similarly, on iPhones, don't always assume that you'll be able to rely on the native back button for Google phones. So like sometimes you're just going to have to build that soft back button into the app design itself. Okay. So another UX prototyping rookie mistake I see is a boring home screen. There's like boring. There's like no content on there, or the content is very lackluster. So the home screen of the app is like the first main screen that you see that will introduce all of like most of the functionality in the content. So when it's completely like devoid of personality and content, it kind of sets the tone for how the rest of the app will work. When I say home screen, I also don't mean like that splash screen. So like the first screen that you see when you load an app where there's like a loading animation or like the logo comes in and out. Like that's not what I'm talking about. The main screen is like when I'm ready to focus on the task, or like when I've encountered my user problem and I need this app to step in and to solve this problem. Like that's the first screen I see. So, when you're designing the app, consider the user and like what they expect to see at the stage. Is it just like, do you only have text? Because that makes it difficult to like quickly identify where I should pay attention. Have you identified like what's actually important to those users? If not, like that's an opportunity for you to identify that core functionality and then make sure it's um, available and accessible from that home screen. Is the home screen dynamic? Meaning, when I reload the app again, when I revisit it, is the content different? So when you think about social media, the reason why people keep going back is that it gives this illusion that there's always new content to look at. And in some cases, it's true, but in a lot of cases, it's faked because like they've queued up all this content and they essentially just like spin the content that shows up. So like I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but it kind of fakes like the dynamic nature of it. So, are there ways that you can potentially make the content in your prototype more dynamic instead of just showing like blocks of text and buttons? Like that's part of the design exercise. And a way for you to kind of step back and look at the bigger picture is just examine some of the apps that you use on a day-to-day basis. What's it look like on their home screen? What keeps your attention? Similarly, if you kind of step outside social media and you're looking at apps of utility, what is most important to you when you open Outlook or Canvas, for example? In those cases, things might not need to be dynamic, but functions like functionality and features might need to be in a consistent place. So make sure you kind of like closely examine that first screen because, again, like first impressions count, and you want to communicate a lot of information in a small amount of space. So use that space wisely. Right. So another mistake is that sometimes there's just not enough context. So there are scenarios where you will be designing products for general audiences. And that means that pretty much anyone off the street can open up your app and understand how to use it and what it's about. In some cases, you're going to be designing things that are highly specialized or technical, and those users may need context on how to use or like what to look for. So as you're designing the onboarding experience, so like what it looks like, how it behaves when someone runs the app for the first time, consider how much information someone needs before they can even get started with your app. And on first blush, those are kind of addressed in two different ways. The first way is just design, like putting it into a prompt. So if you're sending off your app design for like usability testing, you can say, you know, imagine you are shopping for a laptop and you, you want to buy a laptop and warranty. Go do the thing on this app. So like that's one example of providing context, so someone knows like what to do with the app. The second one is just to build it inherently into the app design. And some products do like like they design an onboarding experience. So when you first load the app for the first time, you'll see hints, you'll see context, they'll give you directions on how to use it, and then the next time you load it, you don't see it. Now, to my knowledge, Figma and XD, they don't have that functionality to run it for the first time because they don't store like user behaviors or cookies or anything. So you may want to include like that onboarding information, but maybe just include it in like a menu setting, or like somewhere else in the app where like if they want the tutorial, they can find it. But it's not something that every single person will see every single time that they open up the app. So mistake number 5 is not providing enough context. So provide context. All right, so the next mistake I see from student projects is very sparse design, meaning that there's just not a lot of content there. That they have the screen set up and they have buttons and those buttons go places, but it's just lightweight. Like there's not a lot of functionality built in, and there's certainly not a lot of words. Um, like the features aren't very well thought out, and that's typically due to folks not spending enough time on the design. Again, like you just like not you, but like designers who have like sparse design apps, it's just they've rushed through the process just trying to get something out the door, but they haven't had the opportunity to like really sit down and think through all the functionality, and all the things that they need to design and build for their prototype. In some cases, sparse can also mean that there's like too much text or not enough text, or too much imagery or not enough imagery. So you have to strike a balance between like what the user needs and what they need to see. So like what they need to do and the things that you've designed to enable them to do those things. Um, you can rely on your competitive analysis. You can do user research data. Um, you can observe people in like specific scenarios where you could probably then deduce what information is important to them. Um, but sparse design is typically a result of not spending enough time thinking through that problem and designing the right experience to address those problems. Sparse design can also lead to just like general disinterest or boredom. So, these, so in the case of the school project, you will have my attention, of course, because I'll be grading it and looking at it. You'll have the attention of your design team as well. But when this project, survives Interactive One and hiring managers are looking at it and trying to evaluate you as a designer, you definitely don't want them to get bored. You want them to be engaged. You want them to be like, really engaged in like clicking through all of your features, looking through all of your screens, being like marveling at, your design genius. So sparse design certainly does not address that need, does not give the best impression of your design skills. Another mistake is placeholder content and images. So again, it's usually because you're not spending enough time and you're copy and pasting a lot of content in lieu of like repetitive content. So the way to work through this is to really take the time you need to do the design, and to audit, kind of like go through your experience frequently to see what's missing. Like what's like a design artifact that wasn't meant for like for public eyes? What was a placeholder just for you or just for your team that was supposed to signal that you were supposed to switch out content? Um, Always, when you get opportunities, try to revisit your app with fresh eyes. And when you're working through design deadlines at high velocity, you might not get that time. So, wherever possible, enlist the help of your design teammates or a friend that's not in your class just to like give it a once over, drop in some feedback, and to identify where some of those repetitive elements exist. We in the industry, it's kind of called like banner blindness. It's usually a term used to reference like ad banners, and like people have just like learned to like filter out things that are repetitive and like things that they don't want to see. So in the case of you, when you're designing and you've had all this placeholder content, your brain may literally just like shut it off. Like you just may literally not see it. Um, and sometimes you just need that extra set of eyes to look at it. Editors are very valuable. So make sure so if you can't look at it with fresh eyes, get someone else to look at it. Okay. Um, so another mistake is accessibility. So I talked a little bit about this in the previous video, um, but when it comes to sizing, surprisingly enough, some designers forget that there is a user on the other end of their app design. Conceptually, this is a school project, but we're supposed to think about it in the context of the real world, right? So someone else theoretically would eventually be on the other end of this product design. So have you tested the product on the device it's supposed to render on? So this is a mobile app project. Have you looked at it on a phone? It's okay if it's not designed like for the same phone. So like you might have the iPhone 13, but you may have designed for iPhone 8. That's fine. Just like render it on the phone and see if the buttons are tappable, if the words are readable, things like that. Um, you just need to do like a gut check. You're not doing a QA pass, like a quality assurance pass to make sure that like every single thing translates well. By the nature of these design prototyping programs, you're not going to be able to get it to automatically resize on its own anyways. You just want to make sure it's usable enough for the people who are going to be evaluating your design skills. So that could be me. But again, these prototypes, your website will long outlive your time in my class. So make sure those screens work on mobile devices, or if you're designing for other form factors, make sure you test um, on those devices as well. Um, so some other mistakes I see when it comes to inaccessible size, and specifically is just the text size. Um, so I think, don't quote me on this, but I think Amazon's like base text size is either 13 or 15 point, which is pretty big. But we have a lot of customers on a lot of different device sizes. So we try to do like, a size that's big enough for everybody of every ability. Um, but some designers like forget that they're designing at like 200%. So like they're looking at it and it looks big on their screen, but they forget to zoom out, like literally, like they forget to zoom out to 100% to see what it looks like, on first load. And then they also forget to render it on a phone. So like the font could be even smaller. So again, just make sure every once in a while to zoom out and to look at your design on the device in which it's supposed to render. Similarly, just make sure to look at the navigation elements, make sure they're tappable. Um, Sometimes like the tap targets are much smaller than like the reality of how someone would use that button or use that link. So part of your testing, when you're doing your usability testing, will uncover when someone is like trying to tap something and they can't quite nail like the target. You may just need to make those tap targets a little bit bigger. So instead of just making the link tappable, you may need to like highlight the whole button. If like there's text on a button, you may need to highlight the whole button to make that tappable instead of just the words. Okay, so next mistake, and I have done this, is testing your mobile prototype on your desktop. So a mobile app can be designed on a desktop, but when you're testing it, not just like you as a designer clicking around on it, but when you're sending it off to other people to test, they need to test it on the device that you designed it for. And I've made that mistake before where I designed a mobile experience and I sent out a usability test where they were testing that mobile design on desktop, and like all of my findings were completely null and void, not applicable because I was actually testing like the user interface elements in the design. Now, if I were testing conceptually, like would someone shop for this on mobile? Maybe. The insights might port over, but really to ensure that the data is legitimate and correctly applied, or the insights are correctly applied. Just test the device or test the app on the device in which you designed it for. So mobile app, mobile prototype, test it on a mobile phone. Okay, so only a few more mistakes left to go. So the next mistake is the lack of realism and polish in the app artwork and copy. So a prototype is meant to be a very real, like a hyper realistic model of what is to launch. So when you don't have that level of polish in your artwork, so if it's pixelated or if it's placeholder content, or if the copy has typos in it, it kind of, again, it breaks that suspension of disbelief. So like when they know they're in prototype mode, when they have to look beyond some of those like really simple mistakes, um, it it kind of ruins the user experience, and it gives a bad impression on your abilities as a product designer, either you or like the team. So wherever possible, over index on getting the content right, getting the resolution right for the artwork, making sure there's no typos, and the content just looks hyper realistic, because again, a prototype is meant to be a model of what the real product would look like and how it would function. One of the biggest mistakes I see, I saved this one for nearly last, there's one more slide after this, is that the design is driven by opinion. So I think this button should exist here, or I believe this imagery best communicates next to, this user base. There is a time for decisions being driven by opinions. Most of the time, a designer will have more power, more persuasion over their stakeholders or their design team if they use neutral language and use data points instead to communicate why something should be designed a certain way. So, and here are just like some examples of the things you can say. So, like X percentage of research participants said that they expected, on the home screen to be able to call emergency services. Therefore, that's why like the button is on the home screen. So that's like a slam dunk, right? Like you have the research data, you've cited that it's research that you've conducted, and you've given a figure. So it gives the person who's evaluating your app design a sense of scope. So like that you've done your due diligence. You've actually spoken to the people that might be using this app. Therefore, this decision is rooted in data. Similarly, like other things you can say is like based on observations during testing. So if you can't come up with a numerical figure of like the number of people that encounter this, you can just simply say that like based on certain observations, like here is they've done this, therefore this is how you've adjusted the design to accommodate for those behaviors. Similarly, if you're seeing that your direct or indirect competitors have certain baseline functionality or features, you can also say that their prominent competitors are also doing, like fill in the blank of whatever feature that is. Just because someone else is doing it doesn't mean you should be doing it in your design. But on the flip side, if your competitors are doing it, it could mean that there is a baseline of expectation of how your app should work and behave. So I think it's still valid as something that you should state if it is indeed true. I certainly wouldn't say it if it weren't true. So always expect that someone is going to be able to call you out, for not telling the truth. So if you know that to be a fact, and if it shows up as a bonus, if it shows up in your competitive analysis, then you should definitely state it. Okay, so The last mistake that I'll leave you with is an app that is all looks and no substance, or an app that is all substance and no looks. So design is both an art and a science. It is both how it works and how it looks. And it's hard to have one without the other. And some designers will, some designers are just inherently like better at the visual design than they are at the functionality. Some are better on the functionality and on the visual. I am one of those designers, better on the functionality end than on the visual. But design, those can't be decoupled when they're put in front of a user, when they're out in the world, when they need to be done. They can't be all looks and no functionality, and they can't be all functionality with no looks, because something that works well that doesn't look like it's done is broken to the end user. Similarly, if it works really well, but it looks like it's in wireframe stage, or it looks, like there just isn't enough visually to substantiate the functionality, then similarly, it still doesn't work. Um, so design is really a balance of both, and it's hard to have to focus on both at the same time. In this class, I try to separate out you focusing on the functionality and then having like a really specific stage where you focus on the visuals. So that's where like the design system comes into place. That's where designing from the UX journey map, helps keep you on track. But just know that, while you're zooming in and out, so like doing the feature design, zooming out to the problem statement, every once in a while you're also going to have to zoom in and out when it comes to like balancing the functionality with the way that it visually looks. So rely on your teammates, work with them to develop that shared visual style so that when you go to implement some of those design components on your features, everything looks cohesive and all of the features look like they belong together. Because again, you really need to balance the looks as well as the functionality. You got to do both. You can't just do one or the other. With that, I hope that helps you set some personal expectations for how prototypes should look and feel. If you have any questions or you need a gut check, please reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions. If you message me on Canvas or email me. All right.